Just take me back to when you started this, the goal behind it, and when you look at today, what you've been able to accomplish. Did you ever imagine it?
Yeah. No, I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black kids couldn't go to public schools, and lawyers came into our community to create opportunities for kids like me. Most of the adults I grew up around didn't have high school degrees, not because they weren't smart or hardworking, but there literally were no high schools for black people in our county. And it was so transformative what these lawyers were able to achieve for people of my generation. I got to go to high school, I got to go to college, and so I wanted to be a lawyer to do that for future generations. And that's what brought me to Montgomery, Alabama in the late 1980s, was creating a project that could provide legal services to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford that. And for the first 20 years of my work, it was really all about meeting the legal needs of the poor, people wrongly convicted, people unfairly sentenced. So because lawyers had such an impact on the opportunities I had, when I finished college, I went to law school because I wanted to do the same thing for a future generation. And it was doing legal work for the poor, people who were unable to find legal representation, that brought me to Montgomery, Alabama in the late 80s. And for the first 20 years of our operation, we were all focused on meeting the needs of people who were wrongly convicted or unfairly sentenced, people whose rights had been violated, who didn't have access to counsel. And that work shaped the early part of my career. And then about 12, 13 years ago, I did begin to worry about the larger environment and started fearing that the kind of cultural, social, political forces that gave rise to the civil rights movement were kind of retracting in a way that was restricting my ability to provide adequate legal assistance to the clients I represented. And we just decided that we needed to start doing what we call narrative work, helping people understand why it's important that there be equal justice and access to courts and fairness and reliability. And that made us really examine the absence of truth-telling spaces in America that dealt with hard history. And we're really good at the positive history, the achievements, the success, all of that is well documented and well celebrated. But the hard things, hasn't been really a priority, even in cultural spaces and historic spaces. And that was really the thinking behind creating the legacy sites and creating an understanding of this history. I mean, I moved to Montgomery in the 1980s. We have 59 markers and monuments to the Confederacy, and you couldn't find the word slave, slavery, or enslavement anywhere in the city landscape. This is a majority black city. Our 3 largest high schools were named after Confederate leaders, even though they were 99% African American. And there was just sort of a disconnect with understanding this history. And when we started doing public history, putting up markers that just talked about the history of the trade of enslaved people and things like that, it was so powerful for a lot of people here. It was very emotional to finally see this history recognized. And it just became clear that there's a power in this sort of truth-telling. And I'd gone to Johannesburg in South Africa and seeing the Apartheid Museum and what it did for reckoning with that history and creating a space for healing with that history. I've been to Berlin to see how that city has really changed its relationship to the Holocaust by digging deep into all aspects of the horror and the violence and memorializing all of the tragedy of that. And it's allowed people to just reckon with that history in a way that I think has helped that society become a vibrant democracy in ways that it couldn't without that.
You mentioned horror. I think that's a good word when you go through the museum. What's the most common response you get from people after it?
I think 3 things. I think most people come out and say, I didn't know. The National Memorial documents thousands of lynchings by county and location, and a lot of people who live in those very counties had no idea that a mob of 10,000 pulled somebody out of a jail in the 1940s and tortured them to death, or that hundreds of people were forced out of town behind some incident. And so the number one reaction is, wow, I did not know that. No one has ever presented this history to me. The second is that it's really disheartening to know the depth of inequality, the depth of injustice, the depth of bigotry, the extent to which hatred and animus, fear and anger caused people to do such destructive things to other people. And then the third is that it's energizing and hopeful to know that we can now confront this past and commit to never again allowing that history to manifest itself. I think the whole thesis behind the hundreds of Holocaust museums around the world is that if we educate people about the horrors of the Holocaust, if we get people to appreciate all of the destruction, all of the injury it created, obviously for the victims, but also for the perpetrators in a kind of weird way, we will all commit to never again allowing that phenomena to take place. And I think that's what we're trying to inspire, is that same commitment to never tolerating bigotry and violence and lawlessness and terrorism of the sort that has characterized our history at times.
A couple things I noticed. One is that it is $5 to go to 3 sites.
Yeah.
There's a shuttle included.
Yeah.
You can't find that many places. That was important.
Yeah, we want it to be accessible. I don't want money to be a barrier for this experience. We open the sites up to school kids for free. We do a lot to accommodate. I just think this history is so critical. This information is so important. If you're a U.S. citizen or if you're just living in America, you're going to really struggle to understand some of the things that you see and hear if you don't understand this history. And once you understand the history, I think it really deepens your commitment to the concepts that we lift up, concepts like equality and justice and freedom and fairness. And so I don't want anybody to be priced out of that knowledge. And we want it to be as accessible to people as possible.
And important not to have people with their phones out, taking video, taking photos.
Yeah, we made that decision early on that we wanted people to be present. I think for a lot of people, particularly a lot of young people, they're just so used to kind of being in two worlds at once, the world where they're talking to their friends, interacting with their family, whatever, and the world that's created for them on their screens. And because for a lot of people, this may be the only time in their life when they get exposed to this, we just felt like we really wanted to facilitate that kind of deep, immersive experience.
And give them privacy, too.
And give them privacy. I think for a lot of people who are descendants of people who were victims of terror violence, descendants of people who were enslaved, people who have these intimate relationships with this history. They grew up in a community where a grandparent might have been involved in lynching violence or might have been the target of that. It's very, it can be very emotional, it can be very challenging, and to have an opportunity to do something that for the first time in your life allows you to reckon with that history can feel sacred. The national monument that we have at the Freedom Monument Sculpture Park allows people to find their family name if they're the descendant of people who were enslaved in this country. And that experience of finding your name on that monument, connecting it to your ancestors who were emancipated in 1865 can be really emotional and really powerful. So we don't permit photography in the museum and throughout most of the sculpture park. There are a couple places where we do allow photography because we want people to document their experience. But we try to prioritize the needs of visitors, some of whom are coming with a lot of anxiety and a lot of concern.
You could have put this in Washington, D.C. You could have put this in New York City. You chose Montgomery. Why?
Yeah. I get that question a lot. There would be benefits to being in Washington and New York because they're just easier places to get to. They're already centrally located. The benefit of being in Montgomery is that these spaces have an authenticity that I don't think can be replicated anyplace else. Montgomery had one of the largest populations of enslaved people in the region. We were central to the domestic trade of enslaved people in America. It's one of the most visible and dynamic trading spaces. This is where the Confederacy formed its first White House. So this was ground zero for a lot of that conflict in the 19th century. After Reconstruction, that horrible violence of terror and lynching, Montgomery was in the heart of that. Montgomery is the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. It was the boycott in 1955 that triggered so much of what happened. This is where Dr. King and Rosa Parks and John Lewis and so many people began their work. And in this current moment, when we're dealing with a lot of these issues, you know, the Deep South and Alabama and Montgomery is a place where these things are still playing out. So I think it's been important for people to come where this history lives, where, you know, the soil is, you know, soaked with the sweat of people who were enslaved and the blood of people who were lynched and the tears of people who had to deal with the humiliation of segregation. And to be on these lands gives you a relationship to that history that you can't replicate.
And what do you think this has meant for people in Montgomery to have all of this here?
Yeah, I think it's been, I think, a pleasant surprise. I don't think people had expectations that.
Some hesitation at first? Or?
Yeah, I think people didn't anticipate that hundreds of thousands of people would come for this experience. And I think generally because the whole country has been largely silent about much of this history, there was always that fear, oh, we shouldn't talk about that. But I've been really, really thrilled how the benefits of all of the people coming have spilled over to everybody. And so hotel owners and restaurants and small businesses and contractors and construction people and technicians and engineers and electricians are all experiencing the benefits of there being truth-telling spaces in Montgomery. And that means that people have gotten curious about it and have come to experience it themselves, which I think is positive. And they've come to appreciate that you don't have to fear the truth, that we do have the capacity to reckon with our past and not only survive that reckoning, but actually find new strength, new capacity, new commitment to the things that we all value.
You know, when you started this, or came up with the idea, 12 years ago, you said it was needed then. Is it needed now more than then?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that's happened over the last 5 years is that in 2020, there was this growing recognition that these problems that a lot of people wanted to look away from weren't going to go away by themselves, that we're going to have to reckon with this history. And we saw protests in 2020 all over the country, and you saw corporations and companies and lots of people who had largely been silent about acknowledging the problems of inequality and injustice, saying, no, we've got to talk about this. And in the last few years, there's been a very strong reaction against that talking. Some people have said, no, we want to go back to the way things were. And so that has meant that in a lot of places, there's this perception that you have to be silent, that you can't talk about these difficult things, which has just elevated the importance of our sites in my mind because I just feel like you can run from this history, but you can't hide. It's going to manifest itself in one way or the other. And the beautiful thing I've seen just in my own experience growing up in a community where at first black kids weren't allowed to go to the public schools, to then seeing the benefits of integration and education. We have premier college football programs in the state of Alabama that perennially win national championships. That would not have happened but for the civil rights movement and integration that got past George Wallace saying segregation forever, that got past the majority of people in this state saying we don't ever want to see racist mixing. We got past that, and all of these incredible things have happened as a result of it. And you can look at sports and entertainment and business life and cultural life. I think the same thing awaits us when we fully reckon with this history, we can really repair a lot of the damage. But it's going to be something we have to be intentional about. And right now, there's a lot of people retreating from that intentionality.
Well, you mentioned it. I mean, some of those issues of racial justice that were so key in 2020, 2021 are now arguably under attack. Do you worry about the direction we're headed in? And is there something people can learn from our history that is shaping today?
Oh, I absolutely worry about the kind of counter narrative that says you should just ignore the history. You should not read that book. You shouldn't talk about that topic. You know, whitewashing historic figures from websites and trying to not acknowledge what the Tuskegee Airmen did or what Harriet Tubman did or what the Navajo Codebreakers did, minimizing the struggles of women and people of color who had to overcome segregation and bigotry to become leaders in industry and in the military and athletics. I think ignoring that is really unhealthy. It's sort of like saying to a physician, you know, you can't tell anybody that they have cancer. You're not allowed to do that. And when people come in with those symptoms, they can try to treat those symptoms, but they're not going to cure that disease until they're able to do the hard things. And so I do worry about the rise of that mindset, but it's not unprecedented. You know, I think what makes me feel like, as the generation before me used to always say, we shall overcome, is this long history. During the time of enslavement, abolitionists were vilified. They were threatened with prosecution. It was a capital crime for enslaved people to be in possession of abolitionist material. They used law and threat and violence to make sure that no one talked about the abolition of slavery, and ultimately that effort failed. And now most people would say they'd be on the side of the abolitionists if they were put back in that era. Same thing happened during the time of terror violence and lynchings. Any effort to expose and to criticize those who were perpetrating these acts of lawlessness and terror got minimized, got threatened. Same thing during the Civil Rights era. You know, the White Citizens Councils organized to block the integration of public buses, the integration of schools. There was tremendous threat and menace used to try to prevent that from happening. But in each instance, those who believed in equality and justice, who believed in honest and truth-telling, prevailed, and I think we will prevail in this moment as well.
Two last questions. I mean, we were down in Lowndes County earlier this week, where you probably know they've got a serious issue with wastewater, and money to help fix the problem was recently canceled because of DEI. And we talked with one of the organizers down there. She said we were told to get rid of words like poverty, injustice, black belt.
Yeah, I think it's a really unhealthy moment, and I'd like to hope it remains a moment because there are tens of millions of poor people in this country. And you can try to prevent people from saying poverty, but it doesn't make that problem go away. We do anti-poverty work because there are hundreds of thousands of people in this state who are food insecure. They don't have enough food to feed their children. And what happens when you're chronically poor and you can't get enough to eat and you don't have a safe place to live, it fosters a kind of anger and frustration and mindset that ultimately destabilizes the society. And so eliminating the words that describe honest problems isn't going to make you healthy. And I use the health analogy again. You can ban people from saying cancer or diabetes or high blood pressure, but those illnesses are going to continue. And if we're not allowed to talk about the illnesses, we won't get better. And so I think it's misguided. I think it's not smart, and it's against what history teaches us about how you move forward. You never move forward by committing to governing through fear and anger, controlling things through fear and anger. You move forward when you open up the door and have the courage and the hope and the will to make things better for everybody. And with tens of millions of people, in Lowndes County is a perfect example of unaddressed structural and systemic challenges that affect the poor in that community. The only way we make that a vibrant community where lots of people are doing all the things that we want everybody to be able to do, is if we address things like wastewater systems, and we address food insecurity, we address the absence of any health care services. So I think it's misguided to try to respond in the way that some people are trying to respond. But as I said, it's not unprecedented. For Dr. King and John Lewis and Rosa Parks and Fred Gray, when Fred Gray filed Browder versus Gale, the lawsuit that ultimately led to the desegregation of buses in Montgomery, the response from the Alabama bar was to try to disbar him and to prosecute him and put him in prison. And that effort to use power to silence and intimidate is something, unfortunately, that we've seen over and over again, and we're seeing some manifestations of that now.
Lastly, we're in a theater. We're across the way from a memorial you've done, a hotel, a sculpture garden. Are you surprised yourself it's gotten as big as it has, and what's next?
Yeah, I am surprised because it wasn't our expectation that we would be building this kind of whole infrastructure, but we want to do whatever we can to facilitate the kind of education, the kind of reckoning, the kind of truth-telling that truly liberates our country, that allows us to get to the point where no one is judged unfairly. No one is presumed dangerous or guilty because of the color of their skin, where we don't have to keep navigating the weight of all of this history that creates distrust and conflict and bias. And so we're going to do whatever we can to facilitate that. And right now that means creating places to eat, places to stay, transportation. All of those things become priorities for me in ways that I didn't expect 5 years ago. And it is a surprise, but it's a positive one. I feel privileged to be playing some kind of role to create this new era that I think our nation needs to get to a better place, to get to something that feels more like freedom and equality and justice.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Terrific.
Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. For more stories in your communities, click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV for the latest information, balanced coverage, weather updates every 10 minutes, and more. We'll see you then.